June 6, 1944. A young American medic lies bleeding on Omaha Beach, surrounded by thousands of dead and dying, out of supplies, out of hope. He has been taught that Germans are monsters, brutal, inhuman, deserving only of defeat and death. Then 3 German soldiers emerge from the smoke. They're carrying a stretcher. What happens next will shatter every certainty James McKenzie ever held. Because when the enemy saves your life, immediately, professionally, with the same medical ethics you were taught, every propaganda poster, every training lecture, every comfortable belief about good versus evil collapses into something far more complicated. This is the story of a man who crawled through sand for hours to save soldiers everyone had already written off, who stayed with dying men when doctrine demanded he move on, who was captured by the enemy and discovered that humanity could exist in the most unexpected places. It's a story about the moment when reality confronts belief and wins, about medicine transcending nationality, about the terrible, necessary complexity of war, about 18 minutes on a beach that changed everything, and 3 days in a German bunker that rewrote the meaning of enemy, ally, and what it means to be human. They told him the Germans would kill him. Instead, they operated on him immediately. No waiting, no triage delay, no difference between American and German wounded. In that bunker, for 72 hours, medicine functioned exactly as it was supposed to. And when it was over, James McKenzie returned to American lines carrying a truth that would take 50 years to fully understand. This is that truth. Complicated, uncomfortable, undeniable. This is the story they never taught in history class because it refuses to be simple. The man who crawled, the enemy who healed, the lesson that changed everything. June 6, 1944. 0630 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The surf tasted of iron and salt, and Private First Class James Edward McKenzie, 22 years old, Indianapolis born, trained at Fort Sam Houston, pressed his face into wet sand that felt like ground glass against his cheek. Around him, the beach screamed. Not metaphorically. The beach itself seemed to scream, incoming shells turning air into solid walls of sound, small arms fire creating a percussion so dense it became texture rather than noise, and beneath it all, threading through the mechanical violence, human voices, calls for mothers, calls for medics, calls for God. Mackenzie's medical kit had torn open when he hit the water. His morphine syrettes, 12 of them, each one potentially someone's last mercy, floated somewhere in the channel now, mixing with diesel fuel and blood and the torn pages of letters from home. What remained? 3 rolls of gauze, already soaked through, 2 tourniquets, 1 pair of scissors. Bandages that would disintegrate the moment he tried to apply pressure to a sucking chest wound. He had landed in the 3rd wave at Dog Green sector. That detail would matter later when historians tried to parse which units suffered worst, which companies lost 90% of their men in the first 30 minutes. But in that moment, pressed against sand that exploded in tiny geysers each time a machine gun round skipped overhead, Mackenzie thought only this: I am supposed to save people. I have nothing to save them with. The man 3 yards to his left, Mackenzie had trained with him, knew he came from somewhere in Pennsylvania, couldn't remember his name through the roaring in his ears, had taken rounds through both legs. Femoral hits, probably, the kind of wounds that demanded immediate intervention, tourniquet high and tight, mark the time on his forehead, get him to an aid station within the hour or watch him drain out into French sand. Mackenzie couldn't reach him. Between them lay 15 feet of open beach, where the German MG-42 from the bunker at WN-72 had perfect enfilade. The gun fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 per second, and its crew had ranged this exact stretch of sand before dawn, before the naval bombardment that was supposed to destroy them, but had fallen inland, useless. So Mackenzie crawled. Not the training crawl they'd practiced at Fort Sam, where instructors with stopwatches timed your low crawl and high crawl, and you worried about grass stains on your uniform. This was something else. This was becoming liquid, becoming sand, breathing when the gun traversed away, freezing when it swept back, moving inches at a time while around him the morning assembled itself into a catalog of ways the human body could fail. The Pennsylvania soldier, his name came back suddenly, Kowalski, Thomas Kowalski, had stopped screaming. That meant either unconsciousness from blood loss or death. McKenzie kept crawling. Later, in the interviews that would be conducted by Army historians in 1946, then by academic researchers in the 60s, then by filmmakers in the 90s, McKenzie would struggle to explain why he kept crawling toward a man who was probably already dead. The interviewers wanted heroism. They wanted to hear about duty, about the medic's oath, about American determination in the face of tyranny. What McKenzie remembered was simpler and stranger. He crawled because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean understanding where he was, and understanding would mean acknowledging that everything they'd been told about this landing was wrong. They had been told the naval bombardment would soften the defenses. It hadn't. They had been told the aerial bombing would crater the beach obstacles. It hadn't. They had been told that the DD tanks, duplex-drive Shermans that could supposedly swim ashore, would provide covering fire. Most of them rested on the Channel bottom now, crews drowned or burned, monuments to engineering ambition meeting German artillery. The planners had predicted casualties. They had training for casualties. McKenzie and the other medics had sat through lectures where officers with pointers indicated colored zones on maps and spoke about acceptable losses and evacuation corridors and aid station positioning. The lectures never mentioned what it would feel like when the acceptable losses had names and faces and grabbed your uniform and begged you to tell them they'd be okay when you could see their intestines pulsing through their torn fatigues. McKenzie reached Kowalski after 7 minutes. It felt like hours. It felt like seconds. Time had become unreliable. Kowalski was alive. Barely. His eyes tracked McKenzie's face but couldn't focus. Both femoral arteries had been severed. McKenzie could see the arterial spray pattern in the sand, read it like a text on blood volume and survival time. Under classroom conditions, with proper equipment, immediate evacuation, Kowalski had maybe a 15% chance. Here, with one tourniquet and no plasma, and 600 yards of killing ground between them and anything resembling an aid station, his chances approached zero. McKenzie applied the tourniquet to Kowalski's right leg anyway. He cinched it tight, tighter than training specified, tight enough that he heard something crack, bone, or cartilage, or the metal buckle. He couldn't tell. He marked the time on Kowalski's helmet, 0637. Then he took the second tourniquet and applied it to the left leg. He had no more tourniquets. Somewhere behind him, maybe 30 yards back, maybe 50, distance had become as unreliable as time, another voice called for a medic. And another. And another. The American language of suffering spreading across Omaha Beach, each voice a discrete problem, a separate impossible equation of wounds versus equipment versus time versus chance. The training had been specific about triage. It had been cold and clear and absolutely necessary. Assess, categorize, allocate resources to maximize lives saved. Immediate, treat now. Delayed, treat within hours. Minimal, walking wounded. Expectant, dying, comfort only. Kowalski was expectant. Every medic on that beach knew it. You couldn't save a double femoral arterial bleed with improvised tourniquets and no evacuation. You could make him comfortable. You could stay with him. You could lie and say help was coming. Or you could leave him and crawl to the next man, and the next, and try to patch together enough survival to justify the fact that you were still breathing when so many weren't. McKenzie chose wrong. He stayed. McKenzie stayed with Kowalski for 18 minutes. He would know the exact duration because he checked his watch every 2 minutes, marking time like a countdown, watching the minute hand sweep through increments that felt both glacial and impossibly fast. 18 minutes when 40, 50, maybe 60 other wounded men lay scattered across Dog Green sector, each one bleeding their own mathematics of survival into Norman sand. He stayed because something in him had broken when he saw Kowalski's face. Not broken badly. Not the kind of break that sent men into catatonia or sent them running into machine gun fire with their hands over their ears. A different kind of break. The kind that severed the connection between training and action, between doctrine and humanity, between what you were supposed to do and what you could actually make yourself do. Kowalski died at 06:51. McKenzie felt it happen. The body's transition from animate to inanimate, that subtle shift in weight and temperature that every medic learned to recognize. One moment Kowalski was there, eyes unfocused but present, hand gripping McKenzie's sleeve with enough strength to wrinkle the fabric. The next moment he was gone, and his hand was just meat and bone that happened to be shaped like fingers. McKenzie released the hand gently, arranging it across Kowalski's chest in something approximating dignity. Then he began crawling again. The gun at WN-72 had stopped firing. Either the crew was repositioning or they'd run through their ammunition belt, or naval fire had finally found them. McKenzie didn't know and didn't care. He crawled inland, toward the seawall, toward the voices that still called for help, toward the problem of too many wounded and not enough hands and absolutely no equipment. He passed a man whose face had been removed by shrapnel. Not killed. The body still moved, still breathed through a throat that shouldn't have been able to sustain breathing. McKenzie crawled past him, expectant. Nothing to be done. He passed a lieutenant from Baker Company trying to organize an assault on the bunker complex. The lieutenant was shouting orders to soldiers who were either dead or too pinned down to acknowledge him. McKenzie crawled past him, too. Not wounded, not his problem. He reached a cluster of 3 men huddled behind a blown Czech hedgehog, one of the anti-tank obstacles that had been supposed to stop German armor, but now served as the only cover between the waterline and the seawall. 2 of the men were wounded. One had taken rounds through his right shoulder and chest, bubbles forming in the blood that seeped through his uniform, the telltale sign of a pneumothorax, a punctured lung. The other had shrapnel wounds across his legs and abdomen, less immediately lethal but requiring attention. The 3rd man, unwounded, was a corporal from Dog Company. McKenzie didn't know his name. The corporal looked at McKenzie's medical armband, looked at the 2 wounded men, looked back at McKenzie. "You got morphine?" the corporal asked. McKenzie shook his head. "Plasma?" Another headshake. "What do you got?" McKenzie opened his medical kit. The corporal looked inside. 3 rolls of wet gauze, 1 pair of scissors. No tourniquets. He'd used both on Kowalski. "Jesus Christ," the corporal said. Not an exclamation, an observation. McKenzie began working on the chest wound anyway. He packed the entry wound with gauze. Inadequate. Wouldn't create a proper seal, but might buy a few minutes. He tore strips from the wounded man's own uniform to create additional bandaging. The man, private, very young, maybe 19, kept trying to talk, kept trying to ask if he was going to die. "You're going to be fine," McKenzie lied. "We'll get you out of here." Another lie. The evacuation plan had called for landing craft to return to the beach, load wounded, ferry them to ships equipped as hospital vessels. But the landing craft that hadn't been destroyed were pinned down by the same fire that had pinned down the infantry. The wounded were accumulating. The dead were accumulating. The gap between what was supposed to happen and what was actually happening had become a chasm. McKenzie finished with the chest wound, knowing it wouldn't hold, knowing the man had maybe an hour before the lung collapsed completely, and turned to the second soldier. The shrapnel wounds were extensive but superficial. This one might survive if he could reach an aid station, if infection didn't set in, if shock didn't kill him first. While McKenzie worked, the corporal kept watch. The German fire had slackened. Not stopped, but slackened. Either they were conserving ammunition or casualties had depleted the defenders, or some units had managed to advance far enough to suppress some of the positions. The corporal seemed to be considering something, weighing options. "You need to move inland," he finally said. "There's an aid station supposed to be forming up by the draw at Easy 3. Maybe half a mile." Half a mile. 600 yards of broken ground under sporadic fire. McKenzie looked at the two wounded men. The chest wound couldn't be moved. Moving him would almost certainly finish collapsing the lung. The shrapnel case might make it with help. The corporal saw McKenzie calculating. "I'll stay with him," the corporal said, nodding at the chest wound. "You take Reynolds, the shrapnel case, and get moving. You're more useful with medical supplies than you are with wet gauze." It was the correct tactical decision. It was the correct medical decision. It was the decision that training and doctrine and the entire logic of military medicine demanded. McKenzie couldn't make himself accept it. "I can't just—" "Yeah, you can," the corporal said. His voice wasn't harsh, wasn't cruel, just factual. "You stay here, you watch him die, and then you've got nothing for the next guy. You go, maybe you come back with morphine. Maybe you come back with plasma. Maybe you save somebody." The corporal was right. McKenzie knew he was right. The mathematics of mercy on Omaha Beach demanded that you kept moving, kept triaging, kept allocating your limited capacity to save lives across the maximum number of lives. Staying with one dying man while dozens of salvageable wounded bled out was the opposite of medicine. It was sentiment. It was weakness. McKenzie made his decision. He began gathering Reynolds, helping him to his feet, draping the wounded man's arm across his shoulders, preparing for the 600-yard journey inland. That's when the shell hit. Later, when he tried to reconstruct the sequence, McKenzie could never be certain whether it was an 88 from one of the German artillery positions in the bluffs, or a short round from American naval fire, or something else entirely. The blast was simply there, instantaneous, a sphere of overpressure and fragmentation that unmade the world and remade it in the space between heartbeats. McKenzie came to consciousness. He had no memory of losing it, lying on his back, staring up at a sky that seemed too white, too bright, wrong somehow. His ears rang with a frequency that felt like it was drilling into his skull. His left leg felt strange. Not painful? Strange. As if it belonged to someone else and had been temporarily attached to his body. He tried to sit up. The world tilted. He tried again, more slowly, and managed to prop himself on his elbows. The Czech hedgehog was gone. Where it had been was now a crater, still smoking. The corporal was gone, not dead nearby, just gone, vaporized or flung somewhere McKenzie couldn't see. Reynolds was visible, partly visible, pieces of Reynolds scattered across a 10-foot radius. The chest-wound soldier had been far enough from the blast to survive the explosion itself, but close enough that the concussion had almost certainly finished what the bullet had started. McKenzie looked down at his leg, the left one, the strange one, and understood why it felt disconnected. A piece of shrapnel, irregularly shaped, maybe 4 inches long, had entered his calf and lodged somewhere in the muscle tissue. Blood seeped around the entry wound but didn't pump. No arterial hit. He'd been lucky. He tried to stand. His leg buckled. The pain arrived then, delayed but comprehensive, radiating up from the wound into his hip and spine. He tried again, using a piece of debris for support. This time he managed it, weight mostly on his right leg, left foot barely touching ground. He needed to move inland, needed to reach the aid station, needed to get medical supplies and come back and what? The men he'd been trying to help were dead. The corporal was dead. Kowalski was dead. How many others had died while he'd been unconscious? How many more would die while he limped 600 yards through enemy fire? McKenzie began moving, not limping. That implied a degree of mobility he no longer possessed. Hobbling, dragging himself forward using debris, bodies, anything solid enough to support weight. His progress was measured in yards per minute, sometimes less. He made it perhaps 100 yards before his leg gave out completely. Not the wounded one. The unwounded one, the right leg that had been bearing all his weight, finally succumbing to exhaustion and shock, and the cumulative stress of asking a body to do more than bodies were designed to do. He lay there for a time he couldn't measure. The ringing in his ears had evolved into a kind of music, high and constant and oddly beautiful. The sky was still too white. Shells continued to fall, but they seemed distant now, abstract, someone else's problem. That's when they came for him. 3 figures emerged from the smoke. Mackenzie's vision had narrowed. Shock, probably. Blood loss, dehydration, the cumulative weight of the morning pressing down on his ability to process sensory information, so at first they were just shapes, dark against the white sky, moving with purpose while everything else on the beach moved either with panic or not at all. Then details resolved. Feldgrau uniforms. German. One carried a rifle, muzzle lowered but ready. The other 2 carried something between them, a stretcher, Mackenzie realized, rough canvas stretched between wooden poles. They were walking directly toward him. Mackenzie's hand moved instinctively to his hip, reaching for the sidearm he'd been issued, and lost somewhere between the landing craft and the beach. Gone. His medical kit, what remained of it, lay 3 feet away, the red cross visible on the canvas bag. His uniform, soaked and torn, still bore the medic's armband. Red cross on white background. The Geneva Convention's promise of protection that everyone knew the Germans sometimes honored and sometimes didn't, depending on circumstances, depending on which unit you encountered, depending on variables that Mackenzie had no ability to influence or predict. He waited to die. The soldiers reached him. The one with the rifle, older, maybe 35, with a face that suggested years before this war. A life that included something other than killing, kept the weapon trained on Mackenzie but didn't fire. The other 2 set down the stretcher. One of them knelt beside Mackenzie and began speaking rapid German. Mackenzie shook his head. English, he managed. American. The German soldier switched languages without pause, his accent thick but comprehensible. Where are you wounded? Not are you wounded. Where? The question assumed damage, assumed need, assumed that the first step was assessment rather than interrogation or execution. Mackenzie gestured toward his leg. The German examined it, hands quick and professional, manipulating the tissue around the shrapnel entry wound in a way that suggested medical training. He said something in German to his companions. One of them produced a medical kit. Actual medical supplies, not the stripped remnants Mackenzie had been working with. Morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, proper bandages. We take you, the German medic said. You understand? We take you. Mackenzie understood. Prisoner. He was being captured. The realization felt distant, academic, less important than the morphine syrette the German was preparing, the needle that promised relief from the pain that had been building in his leg like pressure behind a dam. The injection was quick. The German marked the time on Mackenzie's helmet with a grease pencil, 0743, the same way Mackenzie had marked Kowalski's helmet an hour and a lifetime ago. Then the 3 Germans lifted Mackenzie onto the stretcher with a efficiency that spoke of practice, of repetition, of having done this many times before. They began carrying him inland, away from the beach toward the German positions in the bluffs. Mackenzie watched the sky move above him, watched smoke columns rise and disperse, watched tracer rounds draw geometric patterns against white clouds. The morphine was beginning to work. The pain receded to something manageable, something he could observe rather than experience. Around him the battle continued. American forces were beginning to gain footholds, small groups moving up the draws, flanking the bunkers, buying inches with lives. But the German medics carrying Mackenzie moved parallel to the fighting, not through it, following routes they knew, paths that minimized exposure. The one with the rifle stayed alert but never aimed at Mackenzie. The assumption seemed to be that a wounded American medic on a stretcher posed no threat. The assumption was correct. They reached an aid station, calling it that dignified it more than it deserved, set up in a partially collapsed bunker complex, perhaps 800 yards from the beach. The bunker had taken hits from naval fire, but remained structurally sound enough to provide cover. Inside, German medical personnel had established something approaching order. Wounded sorted by priority, surgical instruments laid out on improvised tables, plasma bottles hanging from roof supports. The German medics set McKenzie's stretcher on the ground. One of them spoke briefly to a doctor, Stabsarzt, captain's insignia, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd been doing this too long. The doctor approached, examined McKenzie's leg, said something in German that McKenzie didn't understand. Then, without preamble, without paperwork or triage deliberation, the doctor began treating him. Not comfort care, not stabilization for eventual treatment, actual treatment. The doctor administered a local anesthetic, waited 30 seconds for it to take effect, then began extracting the shrapnel. The procedure was quick, professional, accompanied by a running commentary in German that the doctor seemed to deliver more for his own benefit than for McKenzie's. When the shrapnel came free, a twisted piece of steel casing, irregular and cruel, the doctor held it up briefly as if showing McKenzie what had been living in his leg, then dropped it in a metal pan with a sound like a bell. The wound was cleaned. Sulfa powder applied, proper bandaging, the kind McKenzie had imagined using on Omaha Beach, but never had access to. The doctor worked quickly but not carelessly, his movements economical, practiced. When he finished, he said something to a subordinate, who produced a canteen and held it to McKenzie's lips. Water. Not much. Hydration needed to be controlled after shock and blood loss, but enough. It tasted of metal and chemicals, and was the most perfect thing McKenzie had ever experienced. The doctor moved on to the next patient, German soldier, leg wound, younger than McKenzie. The doctor's manner didn't change. Same efficiency, same care. The realization penetrated through morphine haze. The doctor was simply practicing medicine, not German medicine or American medicine, just medicine. The sorting of damaged humans into categories of salvageable and unsalvageable, the application of knowledge and technique to push as many as possible from the latter category into the former. McKenzie lay on his stretcher and watched. German wounded arrived in groups of 2 and 3, carried by their comrades, sorted by medical staff, treated according to priority. American wounded arrived too, prisoners, casualties from units that had been overrun or flanked or simply unlucky. They received the same triage, the same treatment. A German with a sucking chest wound was expectant. An American with a compound fracture was immediate. The doctor moved between them with the same expression, the same tired competence. Somewhere in training, McKenzie couldn't remember exactly when, couldn't remember which instructor. Someone had explained the Geneva Convention's provisions for medical personnel. Protected status, not to be fired upon, not to be detained unnecessarily, to be allowed to continue their medical duties, even if captured. The lecture had been abstract, theoretical, something that might matter if circumstances aligned in specific ways. What the lecture hadn't explained, what no training had prepared him for, was this. The Germans had supplies. Real supplies, morphine and plasma and sulfa drugs and proper surgical instruments. The German medics were professionals who knew their work. The German aid station was organized, functional, operating under the same medical principles that McKenzie had learned at Fort Sam Houston. The propaganda posters back home showed Germans as monsters, subhuman, cruel. The enemy was supposed to be something you could hate cleanly, fight without complexity, kill without moral burden. But the doctor who had just extracted shrapnel from McKenzie's leg had done it with the same careful attention McKenzie tried to bring to his own work. The medics who had carried him from the beach had administered morphine before transport, had marked the time, had followed the same protocols McKenzie had been taught. The dissonance was physical. McKenzie could feel it in his chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with his wounds and everything to do with the collision between what he'd been told and what he was experiencing. An American soldier was brought in, carried by 2 German soldiers who looked exhausted. The American, Sergeant Stripes, maybe 25, had taken rounds through his abdomen. Intestinal damage, probably, the kind of wound that demanded immediate surgery or near certain death from peritonitis. The German medics moved him to the surgical area without hesitation. The doctor, the same Stabsarzt who had treated McKenzie, began prepping for surgery. He worked quickly, hands moving through preoperative procedures with practiced rhythm. An assistant administered anesthesia. Another prepared instruments. Within minutes, the doctor was opening the American sergeant's abdomen, assessing damage, beginning the delicate work of repairing perforated intestine. McKenzie watched, still lying on his stretcher, unable to look away. The doctor's hands moved with absolute certainty. Clamp, cut, suture, the vocabulary of surgery transcending language, transcending nationality. The sergeant's intestines, gray-pink and glistening under improvised lighting, looked no different from the intestines McKenzie had seen in training cadavers, in anatomy lectures, in the field manual illustrations that reduced human complexity to line drawings and labels. The surgery lasted 47 minutes. McKenzie knew because he watched the second hand sweep around the face of a clock mounted on the bunker wall. German numbers, but universal motion, marking time that belonged to everyone and no one. When the doctor finished, the sergeant was alive, sutured, bandaged, moved to a recovery area where he lay among German wounded who were also alive, also sutured, also waiting to see if their bodies would accept the repairs or reject them through infection, shock, the thousand ways damaged flesh could fail. McKenzie closed his eyes. The morphine was pulling him toward sleep, toward a darkness that felt almost gentle compared to the white sky and the screaming beach and the impossible mathematics of who lived and who died, and why. But before sleep took him completely, one thought surfaced with perfect clarity. He had expected to die on Omaha Beach. Instead, he had been saved by the enemy, saved immediately without triage delay, without the waiting that characterized every American aid station he'd ever seen. The Germans, who were supposed to be monsters, who were supposed to represent everything America was fighting against, had treated him with the same professionalism, the same medical ethics, the same fundamental human decency that he tried to bring to his own work. The realization didn't change the war, didn't change the fact that thousands had died on that beach, that the invasion would continue, that he was now a prisoner who might spend years in a POW camp if he survived. But it changed something else, something McKenzie didn't have words for yet, something that would take years to articulate and a lifetime to understand. The enemy was human. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, practically, medically, undeniably human. And if they were human, then everything else he'd been told needed to be questioned, needed to be examined, needed to be held against the evidence of his own experience and judged accordingly. He slept. McKenzie woke to voices speaking German in low tones, not the sharp, barked orders that American propaganda films associated with the language, but conversational German, casual, almost gentle. Someone was discussing supply shortages. Someone else was worried about his sister in Hamburg. The British had been bombing there, he'd heard, though news was unreliable. A third voice, younger, wondered if the invasion would succeed, if France was already lost, if they would all be prisoners by the end of summer. The Stabsarzt's voice cut through the conversation, not harsh but authoritative, redirecting attention to work. There were patients. There was always work. McKenzie opened his eyes. The bunker's interior had clarified since last he'd seen it. Either his vision had improved or the morphine haze had lifted enough to allow normal perception. The space was perhaps 40 feet long, 15 wide, concrete walls still bearing scorch marks from whatever had partially collapsed the structure. Medical supplies were organized with German efficiency, plasma bottles in one corner, surgical instruments in another, bandages and medications arranged by type and priority. Wounded soldiers lay on stretchers and improvised cots arranged in rows, German and American mixed together, not by design, but by the order in which they'd arrived and been treated. The American sergeant who'd undergone abdominal surgery lay 3 stretchers away, still unconscious but breathing steadily. A German private with a head wound lay beside him. Beyond them, a mix of nationalities united by damage. A French civilian who'd been caught in crossfire, a Canadian lieutenant with both legs shattered, more Germans, more Americans, more bodies asking the same questions of medicine, regardless of the flags they'd been fighting under. A German medic, Not the one who'd treated Mackenzie initially, a different one, younger, with a face that hadn't yet learned exhaustion, approached with a canteen. "You drink," he said in careful English. "Slow. Not too much." Mackenzie drank. The water was tepid, tasted of metal and purification chemicals, was extraordinary. He managed 3 swallows before the medic pulled the canteen away. "Your leg," the medic said, gesturing. "The doctor says it is good. No infection yet. You are lucky." Lucky? Mackenzie almost laughed. He'd been blown up, captured, and was now a prisoner of war in a German bunker, while the largest amphibious invasion in history raged 800 yards away. Lucky seemed like the wrong word, but his leg was functional, the shrapnel was out, and he was alive when thousands weren't. Maybe Lucky was exactly right. "How long was I asleep?" Mackenzie asked. The medic checked his watch. 5 hours, maybe 6. "It is afternoon now, 1:30, almost 2 o'clock, 6 hours. On Omaha Beach, 6 hours was geological time, long enough for the battle's entire character to shift. Mackenzie could hear the difference even from inside the bunker. The artillery was less intense, the small arms fire more sporadic. Either American forces had secured enough of the beach to reduce defensive fire, or German forces had withdrawn to better positions. Or both. "The invasion?" Mackenzie asked. The medic's expression shuddered. "I cannot speak of military matters with prisoners." "Right. Sorry." The medic's face softened slightly. "But I think," he said quietly, "that your people are winning. This morning, we thought we could stop you. Now." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the bunker, the wounded, the reality pressing in from outside. "Now we do what we can." He moved on to check another patient. Mackenzie lay still, testing his leg's range of motion. The wound pulled when he flexed his calf, but the pain was manageable, clean, the kind of pain that signaled damage healing rather than damage worsening. The doctor, the stabs arched, had done good work. Time passed. Mackenzie watched the medical staff work, watched the same routines he'd learned repeated in German, watched triage decisions made according to the same logic he'd been taught. Immediate, delayed, minimal, expectant. The categories transcended language, transcended ideology, reduced warfare to its medical essence. Bodies failing in predictable ways, medicine offering limited interventions, practitioners choosing who received those interventions based on calculations that tried to be objective but never quite were. The American sergeant woke screaming, not in pain, the morphine had handled that, but in confusion, panic. The disorientation of waking in an enemy bunker with a surgical incision holding your abdomen together. 2 German medics rushed to calm him, speaking soothing sounds that needed no translation, holding him still so he wouldn't tear his sutures. The stab sergeant appeared, checked the sergeant's pupils, his pulse, listened to his breathing. He said something in German to the medics, who nodded. The doctor approached Mackenzie. "You speak English with him?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Tell him he is safe. Tell him not to move. His surgery, it is good, but only if he stays still." Mackenzie pulled himself upright, ignoring the protest from his leg. He hobbled the 3 stretcher lengths to the sergeant, who stared at him with wild eyes. "Easy?" Mackenzie said. "Easy. I'm American. PFC Mackenzie, medic. 1st Division. You're in a German aid station. You were shot in the abdomen. They operated on you. You're going to be okay, but you need to stay still." "Germans?" The sergeant's voice was raw. "They got me? They got both of us." "But look around, Sergeant. Look at where we are. This is a medical facility. They're treating us, following Geneva Convention. We're prisoners, yeah, but we're alive." The sergeant looked around, his panic slowly receding as he processed the scene. German wounded, American wounded, medical staff moving between them without discrimination. The architecture of an aid station that could have been American or British or Canadian if you ignored the language and the uniforms. "They operated on me?" the sergeant asked. I watched it. 47 minutes, textbook abdominal surgery. The doctor here. Mackenzie gestured toward the stab sergeant, who watched the exchange with professional interest. "He's good, really good. You'd be dead if they hadn't treated you immediately. Immediately? No waiting, no triage line. They brought you in, assessed you, put you straight into surgery. I've never seen American aid stations work that fast. The sergeant absorbed this. We're prisoners. Yeah, but they're treating us? Yeah. The sergeant closed his eyes. Shit. It was the only appropriate response. The stab czarist approached. He understands? He asked McKenzie. He understands. Good. Tell him. The doctor paused, searching for words. Tell him that I am sorry for his wound. War is terrible. Medicine tries to repair what war breaks. It is not enough, but it is what we have. McKenzie translated. The sergeant opened his eyes, looked at the German doctor, and nodded slowly. The doctor moved on. More wounded were arriving. The battle continued to produce its harvest of damaged flesh. McKenzie watched a German soldier with a chest wound receive the same attention the American sergeant had received. Watched a British paratrooper with both arms shattered get immediate treatment. Watched the medical staff work past exhaustion, past the point where their hands should have been shaking, maintaining the precision that separated life from death. Hours passed. The light filtering through the bunker's damaged sections shifted from afternoon white to evening gold. Someone brought food, black bread, watery soup, ersatz coffee that tasted like burned grain and chemicals. The wounded who could eat were fed. The unconscious received nothing, their bodies not ready for food, their systems too shocked to process it. McKenzie ate. The bread was dense, coarse, nearly flavorless. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. His body, realizing it was being fed, suddenly remembered it was starving, that he hadn't eaten since before the landing, that he'd burned through every calorie during those hours on the beach. He forced himself to eat slowly, knowing that rapid eating after stress and starvation invited vomiting. The young German medic who'd given him water earlier sat down near McKenzie's stretcher. "You are feeling better?" he asked. "Better than this morning." The medic smiled, a small expression that seemed to take effort. "This morning was very bad. We thought," he paused, "we thought you would never land. The Atlantic Wall, the bunkers, the weapons. We were told you would never land. We were told you'd be destroyed by our bombardment," McKenzie said. "Yes. Both sides. We are told many things." They sat in silence. Around them, the bunker hummed with the low sounds of medical work. Breathing, moaning, the clink of instruments, the rustle of bandages. The battle outside had diminished to occasional artillery, distant enough to be almost abstract. "My name is Hans," the medic said suddenly. "Hans Richter. Before the war, I was studying to be a teacher. Literature. I wanted to teach children to love books." McKenzie didn't know what to say. The revelation felt simultaneously intimate and impossible. This enemy soldier, this German, this member of the force that had killed thousands on Omaha Beach, wanted to teach children literature. "James," McKenzie finally said. "James McKenzie. I was working at a manufacturing plant in Indianapolis, making parts for tractors. I wanted to be a mechanic, maybe open my own shop someday." Hans nodded. "These are good dreams. Better than war." "Yeah, you have family. Mother, 2 sisters. You? Mother, father, 1 brother. My brother is also in the Wehrmacht. Infantry. I have not heard from him in 3 months." Hans's expression flickered with something that might have been fear or grief, or the anticipation of grief. "I think perhaps he is dead. I think perhaps I will never know." The intimacy of the conversation felt surreal. Yesterday, no, this morning, because yesterday belonged to a different geological epoch, McKenzie would have considered Hans the enemy. Not Hans specifically, but Hans as representative of Germany, of fascism, of everything America was fighting against. The propaganda was clear. Germans were different, were other, were something that needed to be defeated so thoroughly that they could never threaten peace again. But Hans wasn't different. He was tired, worried about his brother, mourning his stolen dreams of teaching literature to children. He was a medic doing the same work McKenzie did, guided by the same ethics, trained in the same fundamental principles. He was, in every way that mattered medically, identical to McKenzie. The realization was terrifying, because if Hans was human, not metaphorically but actually practically undeniably human, then every German soldier was human. Every life taken in battle was a life with dreams and families and futures that would now never happen. The moral simplicity of fighting evil collapsed into moral complexity. You could be right about the war's necessity while still acknowledging the humanity of those you fought. "Hans," McKenzie said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you treat us?" "The Americans. You could have, military logic would say let enemy wounded die. Reduces their combat strength, conserves your medical supplies." Hans looked at McKenzie as if the question was strange. "We are medics," he said simply. "We treat wounded. It is what we do. But we're enemies. You are wounded. This makes you patients. The Geneva Convention—" "I know the Geneva Convention," McKenzie interrupted. "I know what it says. I also know it gets ignored all the time. I know soldiers shoot medics, ignore Red Crosses, leave enemy wounded to die. You didn't have to treat us." Hans was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "The doctor, Stabsarzt Weber, he says medicine is a calling that exists before nations, before wars. He says when we forget this, we become something less than human. He says the Nazis want us to forget, want us to see enemies instead of patients. But if we do this, we lose something we cannot get back. Do you believe that?" "I don't know," Hans said honestly. "Sometimes I think yes. Sometimes I think perhaps the doctor is too idealistic, too old-fashioned for modern war. But then I treat a wounded American, and I think, this person is someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. If I let him die when I could save him, I am choosing murder over medicine. And if I choose murder, what separates me from the worst things in this war?" The conversation ended there. The Stabsarzt needed Hans for something, and Hans excused himself with a small nod. McKenzie lay back on his stretcher, staring at the bunker's concrete ceiling, trying to reconcile the day's experiences with everything he'd believed that morning. 3 days later, American forces overran the aid station. McKenzie heard them coming before he saw them, the unmistakable cadence of American English, shouted commands in familiar accents, the heavy boots of infantry moving through cleared territory with the confidence of winners. The German medical staff heard it too. Some of them tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons they didn't carry. Others simply continued working, finishing bandage changes, checking pulses, administering morphine to those who needed it. Stabsarzt Weber stood in the center of the bunker, very straight, very calm. He said something in German that made the medical staff stop what they were doing and form a loose line. Hans appeared beside McKenzie. "Your soldiers are here," Hans said quietly. "We are surrendering the aid station." "You'll be treated well," McKenzie said, hoping it was true, knowing it might not be. Hans smiled, tired and sad. "Perhaps. Or perhaps some soldier will remember his dead friends and decide Geneva Convention is just words." He shrugged. "It does not matter. We have done our work. The wounded are alive. This is enough." American infantry burst through the bunker entrance. "First Division," McKenzie saw from their patches, his own division. They swept the space with weapons raised, ready for resistance. Their eyes found the German medical staff standing in formation, found the wounded lying on stretchers, found McKenzie in his torn American uniform with the medic's armband still visible. "Americans here," McKenzie shouted. "Wounded Americans. This is a medical facility." A lieutenant approached, young and wired with combat adrenaline. His eyes moved rapidly, cataloging Germans, Americans, the medical equipment, the blood-stained concrete. "You prisoners?" he asked McKenzie. "Was. Got hit on the beach. Germans brought me here, treated me." The lieutenant's expression hardened. "Treated you?" "Operated on me. Immediately, no waiting." "That doctor," McKenzie pointed at Weber, "he took shrapnel out of my leg. Probably saved it from infection. He also operated on Sergeant Morrison over there. Abdominal wound. Saved his life. The lieutenant looked at Morrison, at Weber, at the neat rows of wounded. McKenzie could see him processing, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd expected to find. "They're surrendering," the lieutenant finally said. "Medical personnel, protected under Geneva Convention. We'll evacuate the wounded, process the Germans as POWs." "They should be recognized," McKenzie said, "for what they did here. They treated American wounded same as their own, better than some American aid stations I've seen." The lieutenant's expression was unreadable. "I'll note it in my report. Can you walk?" McKenzie's leg had improved over 3 days. The stab sarst had checked it daily, changed bandages, watched for infection with the same attention he gave German patients. "Yeah, I can walk." "Then help us identify American wounded, get them ready for evacuation." The next hours blurred into organized chaos. American medical personnel arrived, assessed the wounded, began the process of sorting and evacuation. The German medical staff was separated, searched, processed as prisoners. Weber maintained his dignity throughout, answering questions in careful English, explaining treatment decisions, providing medical records he'd meticulously maintained even during combat. McKenzie watched as Hans was led away with the other German medics. Their eyes met briefly. Hans nodded once. McKenzie nodded back. No words. There were no words adequate to the moment. Just the acknowledgement between two medics who had briefly inhabited the same space where medicine superseded nationality. Sergeant Morrison was evacuated first, stable enough for transport, his sutures holding. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, he grabbed McKenzie's hand. "That German doctor saved my life," Morrison said. "I want that in the record. I want people to know." "I'll make sure they know," McKenzie promised. Morrison was carried out. More wounded followed. American, German, the French civilian, the Canadian lieutenant. The bunker emptied slowly. Its population of broken bodies dispersed to hospitals and prison camps and graves registration units. By evening, only McKenzie and a few walking wounded remained. An American medical captain arrived to inspect the facility. He walked through the space, examining the organization, the supplies, the medical records Weber had kept. When he finished, he approached McKenzie. "You were treated here?" "Yes, sir." "Condition when you arrived?" "Shrapnel wound, left calf." "Significant blood loss." "Shock." "No American medical supplies available." The captain made notes. "And the German medical staff?" McKenzie chose his words carefully. "Professional. Competent. They treated American wounded without delay, using the same protocols and ethics I was taught. The chief surgeon, Stabsarzt Weber, performed abdominal surgery on an American sergeant that I observed. It was textbook work. The sergeant would have died without immediate intervention. You're saying they provided good medical care. Sir, I'm saying they provided excellent medical care, better than what I've seen at some American facilities. And they did it while under fire, with limited supplies, knowing they were probably going to lose the battle and become prisoners themselves." The captain was quiet for a moment. "This goes in my report. Might not change anything. There's still enemy combatants, still going to POW camps. But it goes in the report. Thank you, sir." The captain left. McKenzie sat alone in the bunker in the space where for 3 days the fundamental principles of medicine had functioned as intended, treating all wounded regardless of uniform according to need and possibility. The space was empty now, already beginning its transformation from functioning aid station to historical artifact, to story that would be told and retold and eventually simplified into something that fit narrative requirements. But McKenzie would remember the complexity, would remember Hans talking about teaching literature to children, would remember Weber's tired eyes and steady hands, would remember the moment when he realized that the enemy was human, that humanity existed in bunkers and battlefield aid stations, that medicine could create temporary zones where the brutal arithmetic of war gave way to something older, something that predated nations and would survive long after their conflicts ended. June 6, 1994. Normandy American Cemetery, Colville-sur-Mer. James Edward McKenzie, 72 years old now, Indianapolis resident, retired mechanic, father of 3, grandfather of 7, stood among white crosses and stars of David, 10,000 markers stretching in perfect rows toward the sea. Around him, other veterans gathered for the 50th anniversary, old men in suits decorated with medals, their bodies bearing the accumulated weight of 50 years since that morning on the beach. A journalist approached, young woman with a tape recorder, asking the questions journalists always asked. What was D-Day like? Were you scared? How did it feel to be part of the liberation of Europe? McKenzie gave his standard answers, abbreviated, simplified, the version that fit into sound bites and anniversary specials. Yes, he'd been on Omaha Beach. Yes, he'd been wounded. Yes, he'd been briefly captured. Yes, he was proud of what they'd accomplished. The journalist asked one more question. What was the most surprising thing about that day? McKenzie looked out over the cemetery, over the sea beyond, over 5 decades of memory compressed into moments that still felt immediate. He thought about Kowalski dying in the surf. Thought about the 18 minutes he'd stayed when doctrine said, "Move on." Thought about the German medics carrying him to safety. Thought about Weber's steady hands and Hans's sadness, and the bunker where medicine had functioned exactly as it was supposed to. The most surprising thing, McKenzie said slowly, was learning that the enemy could be decent, that German medics treated American wounded with the same care they gave their own soldiers, that medical ethics could transcend politics and nationality and propaganda, that humanity could exist in the middle of inhumanity. The journalist's expression suggested she didn't understand, that this wasn't the kind of answer that fit anniversary narratives about good versus evil, liberation versus tyranny, America's righteous victory. McKenzie didn't elaborate. Some truths were too complex for tape recorders, too nuanced for commemorations. The war had been necessary. He believed that, absolutely. Evil had to be opposed. Tyranny had to be defeated. The Nazi regime had to be destroyed. But necessity didn't eliminate complexity. Victory didn't erase the humanity of those defeated. He had crawled through sand to save men who died anyway. He had been saved by enemies who treated him with dignity. He had learned that medicine could create temporary spaces where people were simply people, damaged, vulnerable, deserving of care regardless of the flags they fought under. It was the most important lesson of his life. And 50 years later, standing among graves of men who'd never had the chance to learn such lessons, McKenzie carried it still. A weight that felt both heavy and necessary. A truth that refused simplification. A memory that demanded to be preserved exactly as it happened, complicated and contradictory and utterly human. He stood among the crosses and remembered. That was all he could do. That was everything.